Thank you, President Leibowitz and Provost Fierk. What a thrill it is for me to be with all of you here on this special day. Congratulations to each and every one of you graduates of Brandeis. I'm honored to be a part of your class and to have this opportunity to share with you. Now, these are challenging times, and the fact that we can't all be together is an indicator of the incredible year we've had to navigate, the extraordinary difficulties that so many have had to manage. And in times of crisis and challenge, it's important to think about the things and the people that matter most. And I want to begin by just acknowledging the role of every family member, of every graduate, because none of us could be here by ourselves. Many of you would not be in this place without love and support from parents and grandparents and siblings, aunts, uncles, and I just want to affirm the critically important role that all of you have played, all of you family members, in contributing to the lives of your loved one. I think about my family a lot. I'm going to repeat a story I've told before, but I'm the product of a family that in many ways was headed by the traditional African-American matriarch. I had a grandmother, and my grandmother was a real force in our family. She was tough, she was strong, but she was kind and she was loving. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. She was born in the late 1880s, and the experience of being raised by people who had endured slavery shaped her worldview. And she had a way about her that always drew you near her. She could be tough and strong, but she was also kind and loving. My grandmother was the end of every argument in our family. She was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And the difficulty when I would visit my grandmother was that she had 10 children. My mom was the youngest of her 10 kids, and when I would spend time with her, I had dozens of cousins running around competing for her time and attention. And I remember when I was a little boy going to her house and my cousins were running around, and I got up one morning and I went into the living room, and my grandmother appeared to be staring at me. She was across the room, and she had this very sober look on her face, and she kept staring. And finally, she came over to me and she said, "Come on, Brian, you and I are going to have a talk out back." And I remember it clearly because it was just such a momentous event. And she took me by the hand and she took me out back. I was like 9 or 10 years old, and she sat me down and she said, "I'm going to tell you something, Brian, but you can't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama." And then she looked at me and she said, "I want you to know I've been watching you." And then she said, "I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." And I remember just staring up at her, just accepting and receiving these words. And then she said, "I need you, however, to make 3 promises." I said, "Okay, Mama." And then she said, "The first thing I need you to promise me is that you'll always take care of your mother." She said, "That's my baby girl, and I need to know that you'll always love her." I adored my mom, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then my grandmother looked at me and she said, "The second thing I need you to promise is that you'll always do the right thing, even if the right thing is the hard thing." And I thought about it and I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then the third thing she said to me was, "I need you to promise me one last thing, Brian, and the last thing I need you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol." Well, I was 10 years old, so I said, "Yes, Mama." And I grew up in the country. I have a brother and a sister. And when I was about 14 or 15, one day my brother came home, and somewhere he'd gotten this beer. I don't know where he got it, but he got this beer. And he took me and my sister out back, and he had some and my sister had some, and they were offering it to me, and I was hesitating. I said, "No, that's all right. That's okay. I'm not gonna have any." And my brother kept saying, "No, I had some. Your sister had some. Have some." I said, No, that's all right." And then my brother stared at me and he looked at me and he said, "I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Oh, Mama tells all the grandkids that they're special, and she makes them promise that they'll never drink alcohol." I was devastated, but I will tell you something. I'm now 61 years old, and I will admit to you that I've never had a drop of alcohol. And I don't say that because I think there's something virtuous about that. I say that because I believe that when we create identities that mean something to the people around us, we can say things to our loved ones, but we can say things to our neighbors. We can say things to the world that might get them to do things that they might not otherwise do. There was something about the integrity of my grandmother. There was something about her life that moved me and stayed with me. I just didn't want to give up on that promise. And I say that because many of you will become teachers and doctors and engineers and business leaders. And I don't think it's enough to have those identities. We need you to be good teachers, compassionate nurses, caring business leaders, generous philanthropists. All of the roles that we have are accompanied by identities. And it's the identity that I want to talk to you about today. So I think each of you is special. And even though I've given away the punchline, I'd like you to consider making promises today. I'd like you to consider making promises not just to Brandeis, not just to your family, but to yourselves. And the promises I want you to make are about dealing with the injustice and inequality that we see around us. We're living at a time when there's tremendous injustice in the world. There is a justice deficit. There's too much poverty, there's too much hunger, there's too much suffering, there's too much pain, too many people are excluded, too many people are mistreated, too many people are abused, and we have to find ways to connect to the suffering in the world if we are going to be the kind of human beings that I think we are called to be. And I think we need to promise ourselves that we won't let the stress and the challenges of life cause us to be indifferent to the suffering of others. I work in the criminal justice system, and what I've seen happen in this country troubles me. We had less than 300,000 people in our jails and prisons in the early 1970s, but today we have 2.3 million people in our jails and prisons. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have some nearly 5 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrest histories, which means that when they try to get jobs or try to get loans, they're often disfavored by that arrest history. We've done terrible things to women. Over the last 25 years, the percentage of women sent to jail or prison has increased 800%. And 80% of the women we put in jails and prisons are single parents with minor children. In 2001, the Bureau of Justice issued a report that projected that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. And the hardship of that outcome, that forecast, was accompanied by an even greater problem, which was our indifference. There was no pandemic-like response. We didn't seem to take seriously what that would mean to these communities. And in too many places, we've allowed narratives to emerge that cause us to be indifferent to injustice, to suffering. And the promise I hope you'll make is that you will commit yourselves to changing narratives that sustain inequality, that sustain injustice, that sustain mistreatment and bigotry. We have mass incarceration in this country because for too long, we were governed by elected leaders who preach what I call the politics of fear and anger. And I hope you'll consider promising to not be governed by fear and anger. I think that fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice, of oppression, of abuse. In the 1970s, our politicians said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. And we're going to use a criminal justice response to deal with addiction and dependency. Now, they could have said that people suffering from addiction and dependency have a health problem, and we need a health care response. But it was effective to engage in the fear and anger connected to crime, to use this crime model instead. All over the world, we are seeing leaders and policymakers engaging in the politics of fear and anger. And we have to understand the threat that that poses. We've seen too much suffering, too much abuse that was a result of leadership organized and fueled by fear and anger. The Holocaust was a horrific era governed and shaped by narratives of fear and anger. In Nigeria, children are being killed, and if you ask the people who are perpetrating these horrific terrorist acts why they do what they do, they can give you a narrative of fear and anger all across the world where people are abused and mistreated and taken advantage of. The perpetrators of that violence can give you a narrative of fear and anger. We have to understand the threat that that poses, and so I hope we'll consider promising to not be governed by fear and anger, to change this narrative, to instead affirm the power and necessity of human rights and dignity. I'll tell you another story about my grandmother. My grandmother, when integration came to our community, started doing this thing with me that she hadn't done before. I was 9 or 10 years old, and she started coming up to me, giving me these hugs. And she was squeezing me so tightly, there were times when I thought she was trying to hurt me. And my grandmother would see me an hour later and she'd say, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And by the time I was 10, my grandmother had taught me, whenever I would see her, the first thing I would say is, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile, and I didn't appreciate what she was teaching me until much later. My grandmother worked as a domestic worker her whole life. She lived into her 90s, but when she got into her 90s, she fell one day and she broke her hip. And then she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was dying. I was in college at the time, and I went to see my grandmother. She was on her bed, and her eyes were closed, and I remember taking her hand and just pouring my heart out to her. I wasn't even sure she could hear what I was saying, but I was standing there, and I just was pouring my heart out. And at some point, I knew I had to go, but I just kept talking. And finally, when I realized I couldn't delay it any longer, I took a step away, knowing I wouldn't get a chance to talk with my grandmother again. And just when I took that step, my grandmother squeezed my hand. And then she opened her eyes and she looked at me. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you. I want us to reject the politics of fear and anger. I want us to change that narrative and embrace the narrative that I was given by people who I understood loved me." And that narrative is rooted in affirming humanity and dignity of every person. I told you that story about my grandmother, not because I'm just trying to be sentimental, but I genuinely believe that we each have the power to get close to people who are suffering, to get close to people who've been treated unjustly, to get close to people who've been disfavored. And sometimes we need to affirm their humanity and dignity. Sometimes we have to be willing to embrace those that are struggling and suffering. It is the way in which we rebut and push against fear and anger. That narrative has to change, and that's the promise I'm hoping you'll consider engaging in, changing narratives. We have to change the narrative about race in this country. I don't think we're free in America. I think we're burdened by a long history of racial injustice. I think it's contaminated the atmosphere. The environment is polluted with these toxins created by our long history of racial injustice. And many people have argued that at some point these toxins will just dissipate, but I don't believe that. I believe we're going to have to clean the air. We're going to have to change the narrative. We're going to have to talk about some things that we haven't talked about before. I think we're going to have to talk about the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. I think what happened to indigenous people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of native people through famine and war and disease, and we didn't talk about it. We didn't acknowledge it. We created a narrative of racial difference instead. We said, oh, those indigenous people, those native people, they're savages. And we allowed that rhetoric to justify abuse and mistreatment. We created a constitution envied around the world that promotes equality and justice for all, but we didn't extend those protections to indigenous people. We relied on that narrative of racial difference to say that they don't matter, their lives don't matter, and that same narrative of racial difference caused us to accept and tolerate 2.5 centuries of slavery. And I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I think the real evil of American slavery was the narrative we created to justify the abuse of black people. It wasn't the involuntary servitude. It was this false idea. Enslavers didn't want to feel immoral or unjust. And so they had to create this narrative that black people aren't as good as white people. And that false narrative that said that black people aren't fully human, black people aren't fully evolved, black people are less deserving, less capable, less worthy, that narrative was the true evil of American slavery. And we had a civil war, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. We passed the 13th Amendment, which talks about ending involuntary servitude and forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy. And after the Civil War, we had a century of terrorism in this country. Black people were pulled out of their homes. They were beaten, they were drowned, they were tortured, they were burned alive, they were lynched, often on courthouse lawns. And our government did nothing. Law enforcement did nothing. Communities did nothing. We allowed mob violence to traumatize millions of black people in this country. And we haven't really acknowledged what that represents. Older people of color come up to me sometimes. They say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. We haven't acknowledged the fact that the demographic geography of this country was shaped by racial terror. The black people in Cleveland, the black people in Detroit, the black people in Chicago, the black people in Minneapolis, in Boston, Los Angeles, and Oakland did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They largely went to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. There are lines from Alabama to LA and Mississippi to Chicago, and these lines were created by people fleeing terror and violence. There was a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that God assigned to black people as a result of our centuries of slavery. And even in the 1950s and 60s, when courageous people came together to protest and to fight for civil rights, to demand that we honor the voting rights that every American should enjoy, to end segregation, even through all of that, that narrative of racial difference persisted. That ideology of white supremacy survived. And today it breaks my heart to have to say to you that you can be a Brandeis graduate, you can be a doctor, you can be an engineer, you can be a lawyer, you can be kind, you can be generous, you can be compassionate. But if you're black or brown, you will go places in this country where you have to navigate a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. And I can tell you, because I'm getting older, that it's exhausting. You get tired when you have to keep navigating these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. And that's why I believe we have to change this narrative. We have to commit to a new era of truth and justice. Truth and justice are the antidotes to fear and anger. It is the way we recover. It is the way we reckon with bad histories. It's the way that we get to a better place. In South Africa, after apartheid, there was an acknowledgement that there had to be truth and reconciliation. They understood that they couldn't not talk about the damage, the trauma, the pain, the suffering created by that horrific era of apartheid. I've been to Berlin, Germany. When I go to Berlin, I'm always fascinated by what I see. It's hard to go 200 meters in Berlin without seeing markers or stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted and so horribly killed and taken away during the Holocaust. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of Berlin. There are signs everywhere, and even the cab drivers and the hotel operators encourage you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. And when I go there, I'm stunned by this effort at trying to reckon with this history. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. It'd be unconscionable for someone to propose that they honor the architects and defenders of the Third Reich. But in this country, I live in a region where the landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy, where we celebrate the perpetrators of slavery, the defenders of white supremacy, where we have not reckoned with this history, and that reckoning must happen. And I believe we have to commit to this era of truth-telling, truth and justice, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration, truth and reparation. I believe these things are necessary because that's the path to a better place. And I don't talk about slavery and lynching and all of these difficult parts of our history just because I want to punish. I don't have any interest in punishing this nation. That's not my interest. My interest is in liberation. I believe something better is waiting for us. I really do. I believe there's something better out there. I think there's something that feels more like freedom than what we've experienced in this country. There is something that feels more like justice, feels more like equality, but we will not get there unless you promise yourselves to push against fear and anger and to commit to truth and justice. It's not always easy, but I believe it is necessary. I believe it's even essential to how we get there. We have these sites in Montgomery, Alabama, and I want to invite each and every one of you to come and visit us in Montgomery. We couldn't be together today, but I hope you'll come to Montgomery and visit our Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. I want you to visit our National Memorial for Peace and Justice that honors thousands of black victims of lynching in the country. And I want you to visit because these are truth-telling spaces. And if you visit, you'll see in our museum an exhibit of jars of soil. We ask people to go to lynching sites, and they collect soil from these sites, and they put them in jars that have the names of people who were lynched and the dates where these lynchings took place. And then people bring them back, and we have a whole exhibit that displays the soil collected from these places where such tragedies took place. And I was talking to a woman who did one of our soil collections, a middle-aged black woman. She went to a site to dig soil, and when she got there, she said she got nervous because it was a very remote location. It was on a dirt road, and as she found the site where the lynching took place, a truck drove by. And there was a big white guy in this pickup truck, and he drove by and he stared at her as he drove by. She said she got nervous, and then the man slowed down in his truck and he stopped, and then he turned around and he drove back by again and he stared at her some more. She said she got even more nervous, and then the man stopped his truck, got out of the truck and started walking toward her, and she was terrified. We tell people when they collect the soil that they don't have to explain what they're doing, and she decided she was going to tell that man she was just getting dirt for her garden. And the man walked up to her, and sure enough, he said, "What are you doing?" And she told me later, she said, "Mr. Stevenson, I was going to tell him I was getting dirt for my garden, but all of a sudden something got a hold of me." And she said, "I told that man I'm digging soil because this is where a black man was lynched in 1937, and I'm going to honor his life today." She said she got nervous until she started digging, and the man stood there. And then the man said, "Does that paper you're carrying talk about the lynching?" And she said, "Yes." And then he said, "Would it be all right if I read it?" And she gave the man the paper as she started to dig, and the man read the paper that detailed what happened during the lynching. And then the man put the paper down and stunned this woman by saying, "Excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you?" And she said yes, and the man got down on his knees next to her, and she offered him the implement to dig the soil, but he said, "No, no, no, you use that, I'll just use my hands." And he started throwing his hands into the soil and putting the soil in the jar, and he kept throwing his hands into the soil, and his hands were turning black with the soil. And the woman was moved by the conviction and the commitment he was making, and it touched her. And before she realized it, a tear was running down her face. The man looked at her and he said, "I'm so sorry, I'm upsetting you." And she said, "No, no, no, you're blessing me." And they kept digging together. He used his hand, she used the implement, and finally they got the jar almost filled with soil, and she noticed that the man was slowing down. And she turned to the man and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she said, "Are you all right?" She could see the man's shoulders shaking, and then she saw a tear running down his face, and she said, "Are you all right?" And that's when the man turned to her and he said, no, ma'am, I'm not." He said, "I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather who participated in this lynching." She said they both sat there on the roadside and wept. They finished putting the soil in the jar. The man turned to her and he said, "I would love to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil." And she said, "Okay, we can do that." But she said, "But I want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil too." And they took pictures of one another. Then she said, "I'm going back to Montgomery to put this soil in the museum." And the man said, "Would it be all right if I came with you?" And they came to Montgomery, both of them. And they put that jar in our exhibit. And it was a powerful thing to see. And I don't tell you that story because I believe that beautiful things like that always happen when we tell the truth. But I do believe that until we tell the truth, till we commit to truth telling, until we commit to changing narratives, we will deny ourselves the beauty that is justice. And we need more justice. I want you to promise that you'll think about ways to resist fear and anger, to change narratives. Secondly, I hope you'll promise to stay hopeful, because in this moment of so much difficulty, we need more hope. I believe that you represent the hope of a new generation. You represent the hope of a better future. You represent the hope that comes with the possibilities that when people come together, they can do great things. I want you to reject hopelessness. I believe that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I think injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. I want you to understand that your hope is your superpower. Many of you are here today because you had people come before you that had a hope that one day you might be able to do things they could not do. Hold on to that hope. Be willing to believe things you haven't seen. I've been practicing law. I've stood next to condemned prisoners. I've had to do difficult things. I'm the great-grandchild of people who were enslaved. My great-grandfather learned to read as an enslaved person. He had no reason to believe he'd be free, but he had that hope. He gave that hope to my grandmother, and even though she didn't have the opportunities to go to school, she loved reading, and she gave that to her 10 children, and my mom gave that to me. We grew up poor in a community where black children weren't allowed to go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. He couldn't go to high school in our county. But lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools by enforcing the hope of Brown versus Board of Education. Because those lawyers got close to people like me, because they had hope, I got to go to high school, I got to go to college, I got to go to law school, and never met a lawyer until I got to Harvard Law School. And I have this hope that if you are hopeful, in the exercise of the opportunities and talents that you have, you can open doors for people. I've been in Montgomery, Alabama here for the last year and a half, and it's been really interesting to reflect on the people who've come before me. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. The generation that came before me would put on their Sunday best. They would go places to pray, and they knew they'd get bloodied and beaten and battered just for asking for civil rights, but they went anyway. They had this hope. I want you to promise that you'll stay hopeful, because if you are hopeful, there will be nothing that you cannot do. And lastly, on this glorious day, at this incredible moment, I hope you'll be open to promising to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient, because we cannot create more justice if we're unwilling to do uncomfortable and inconvenient things. I know it's a lot, but I hope you'll do it. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And because of that, justice requires that we understand the other things you are. I don't believe the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And finally, I believe that we will not be judged by how well we do in life, by the amount of money we earn, by the success and the status we achieve. I ultimately believe we will be judged by what we contribute to ending injustice and inequality, what we do to serve, what we do to help those who are in need. I hope you'll consider that, maybe even promise to not forget that. I promise that I will be cheering you on as you make your journey, as you do the great things that I know you can do, as you stand against narratives of fear and anger, as you change narratives, as you stay hopeful, and as you do uncomfortable and inconvenient things in service of a better world, a more just world. I want to wish each and every one of you all the best on that journey. Thank you all very much.